At some point in every console generation, something inevitable happens. The hardware gets smaller. But these console redesigns aren't upgrades. They're what companies do once they stop trying to convince you. Because if you look at when these smaller, improved versions actually show up, it's always at the exact same moment, right after the console has already won. The PlayStation becomes the PS1 in the same year the PS2 launches. The PS2 shrinks into the Slim after tens of millions of units are already sold. Even the NES gets redesigned in 1993, years after its peak and after the Super Nintendo is already out. So, if these were really about making the hardware better, why do they only show up when the battle is over? The common explanation is that console redesigns are about making the hardware better, smaller, cleaner, simpler, a polished final form of the original machine. But that explanation assumes something critical, that these redesigns exist primarily to benefit the player. But once you actually look at what is changed, that assumption collapses fast. Let's start with what these redesigns actually do. When Sony released the PS2 Slim in 2004, they made a huge deal about the size reduction. The internal volume dropped to about 23% of the original, and the weight was cut to roughly 45%. That sounds like a significant upgrade, especially to the console's footprint, until you look at what disappeared. The original PlayStation had an expansion bay where you could install a hard drive. In the Slim version, that option was now gone. And in later versions, Sony went even further. They removed the original PlayStation CPU from the system entirely. This was the hardware that allowed backwards compatibility with the PS1, which meant those games now had to run through software emulation. Games that worked perfectly on earlier models could now have glitches, or not run at all. So the smaller system wasn't just less expandable, in some cases it was less reliable at doing what the original already did. And this isn't a one-off. The 1993 redesign of the NES removed composite video output, forcing players to use RF, which meant worse image quality. The PS1 removed the parallel and serial ports of the original PlayStation, cutting off compatibility with devices like the Game Shark and even multiplayer capability through the link cable. Even Sega followed this pattern. The Genesis Model 2 simplified the internal hardware and degraded audio quality in the process. So the pattern isn't redesigns improve the system, it's they simplify it. And simplification usually means removal. Now look at when these redesigns happen. The PS1 launches in the same year as the PS2. By that point, the original PlayStation had already shipped over 82 million units. The PS2 Slim arrives 4 years into the life cycle of the PS2, and by then it had already passed 70 million units shipped. The NES toploader is very strange. It came in 1993 after its successor is already established in the market. So if redesigns were about making the product better, why do they only appear after that product no longer needs to compete? By the time redesigns happen, the console is no longer trying to win the market. It already has. At that point, the goal changes completely. It shifts from expanding the market to extracting every last dollar it can from it. And here's how that works. At launch, consoles are expensive, complex boards, multiple chips, inefficient production. In many cases, companies are barely making money, sometimes losing it. But over time, everything shrinks. Chips integrate, boards simplify, components disappear, and companies actively push this process. Sony said it directly. They were working to aggressively cut costs by reducing the number of parts in both the PS1 and PS2. That's not about improving your experience, that's about improving their margins. Every part removed is margin gain. Now, by the time redesigns happen, the leverage has already flipped. The console doesn't need to prove itself anymore. It's already the standard. Developers are building for it by default. Retailers are stocking it automatically. Players aren't comparing it, they're recognizing it. At that point, the question isn't how do we make this system better, it's how do we make it cheaper to produce and easier to keep selling. Because once the ecosystem is locked in, you're not fighting for adoption anymore. You're optimizing for extraction. Now, with any popular product, there's always multiple waves of buyers. People who didn't buy at launch, people who waited, people who only jump in when the price drops. Redesigns are built for them. Sony didn't position the PS1 as a technological leap. They positioned it as a compact version of something people already trusted. The older system didn't disappear, it got repurposed for later adopters. Important to note, too, is that every console generation follows the same arc. The first phase is expansion. Sell hardware aggressively, build the install base, win the market. Once you've done that, you can move into phase 2, which is harvesting. Cut manufacturing costs, lower retail price, maximize margin, extend the life cycle. Redesigns are the line between these two phases. They don't mark improvement, they mark permission to stop competing and start extracting. And then there's somewhat of a hidden layer in the retail strategy. This is a piece that many people miss. Smaller consoles don't just reduce cost, they win shelf space. They can sit next to the latest and greatest hardware without looking outdated. They're easier to bundle, easier to display, easier to move. Redesign is not just engineering, it's also retail warfare. The most compelling example of this strategy occurred in the year 2000. That's when Sony launched the PlayStation 2, and at the same time, they launched the PS1. That overlap isn't accidental. It solved a problem. Because once the PS2 exists, the original PlayStation can't compete as the future anymore. But it doesn't need to. It already has an audience, so its role changes from leading the market to catching everyone who hasn't entered it yet. The PlayStation becomes the fallback, the cheaper option, the system that keeps selling while the new one ramps up. And Sony's numbers reflect the genius of this strategy. In 2000, they expected their games division revenue to increase, even as original PlayStation sales were declining. Now, obviously, the PS2 was coming, which would contribute to their sales and growth. But paired with the continued sales of the PS1, the console stopped being a platform they were building and became an asset they were managing. It's important to note that these redesign shifts don't just affect hardware, they reshape the entire industry. Players get a cheaper entry point, smaller systems, lower prices, easier access. But there's a trade-off. You're getting the version designed to cost less, not do more. The version that removes options instead of expanding them. For developers, it extends their life cycle. A cheaper console means more late adopters. More players means more software sales, which is why older systems don't just disappear, they often linger because the business model rewards it. And then at the industry level, it creates something bigger. Layered markets, a premium new system, a cheaper previous gen system, both selling at the same time. That overlap isn't messy, it's intentional. It means they're not trying to sell everyone the same console anymore. They're charging one group for the future and selling the other group on the past. So instead of saying console redesigns are the final evolution of a system, it's probably more accurate to say they're the most profitable version of it. They mark the shift from building the market to extracting from it, from winning players to monetizing the ones who waited. That smaller console you remember, it wasn't made because the hardware got better. It was made because the business did. So let me ask you, if you had the choice, the original hardware or the cheaper version companies optimize for, which one do you actually trust? Let me know in the comments, and if you made it this far, as always, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, happy gaming, my friends.